cursed doll.
It was on her 7th birthday when Emily first received the doll. The party was a modest affair, just her parents, a cake, and a small gathering of neighborhood friends. As Emily tore through the gift wrapping of a large, elegantly wrapped box, she didn't expect the strange gift that awaited her inside. The doll was nestled in tissue paper, its glassy eyes staring up at her. It looked almost exactly like her. Same brown curls, same bright blue eyes, same freckled face. The dress the doll wore was an exact replica of the one Emily was wearing for her birthday, white with little pink flowers and lace around the edges. The resemblance was uncanny, unsettling even. For a moment, Emily just stared at it, unsure of how to feel. Her mother leaned over and smiled. "Oh, Emily, isn't she beautiful? Look how much she looks like you." Emily forced a smile, though a strange knot had formed in her stomach. She lifted the doll out of the box, feeling the smooth porcelain under her fingers. The doll was heavier than she expected. Its glassy eyes reflected the room's light, almost as if it was studying her in return. "Who is it from?" Emily asked, glancing at the small card that had come with the box. But there was no name, no message, just a simple note written in neat cursive. "Take care of her, and she will take care of you." "Strange," her mother mused, picking up the note and turning it over as if expecting to find more. "There's no name on the card. Maybe it's from one of the neighbors." Emily nodded absent-mindedly, still holding the doll and feeling uneasy under its fixed gaze. Her friends gathered around her to admire the gift, but none of them seemed as disturbed by it as she was. That night, after the party had ended and everyone had gone home, Emily placed the doll on the top shelf of her bedroom. It sat there, watching her as she got ready for bed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was wrong, something she couldn't explain but felt deep in her bones. But it was just a doll, she reasoned. Just porcelain and fabric, nothing more. As she crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, she glanced one last time at the doll. It sat motionless on the shelf, its empty eyes gazing into the darkness. She turned over and closed her eyes, trying to forget the strange feeling. That night, she dreamed of the doll. In the dream, it wasn't just sitting still. It was walking, its little porcelain feet tapping softly on the wooden floor. It moved with a strange, jerky rhythm, its glassy eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It reached for Emily's bed, climbing slowly up the blanket, its tiny hands grabbing hold of her hair. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll's face was right in front of hers now, smiling in a way that was far too human. Then, its glass eyes blinked. Emily woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was still dark, but she could feel something was off. Slowly, she turned her head toward the shelf where she had placed the doll before bed. Her breath caught in her throat. The doll wasn't there. She sat up in bed, her eyes scanning the room frantically. Then she saw it. The doll was sitting on her bedside table, its head tilted slightly as if it had been watching her sleep. Its glassy eyes gleamed faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She was certain that she had left the doll on the shelf across the room, but now it was right next to her bed. "Mom," Emily whispered into the darkness, her voice shaky. She wanted to call for her parents, to tell them something was wrong, but she didn't want to seem foolish. It was just a doll. Her imagination was probably playing tricks on her. Still, the sight of it unnerved her deeply. She didn't touch the doll. Instead, she threw the covers over her head and squeezed her eyes shut, hoping that sleep would take her away from the strange, creeping dread that filled the room. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of her mother calling her down for breakfast. She sat up, groggy and disoriented, and glanced at the bedside table. The doll was gone. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed the entire thing. Maybe she had imagined it. But when she looked at the shelf across the room, there it was, sitting in the exact same spot she had placed it the night before. Emily's stomach churned. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't prove it. The doll had moved. It had been on her bedside table. She was sure of it, but now it sat perfectly still on the shelf, as if it had never moved at all. The day passed uneventfully. Emily tried to distract herself with her usual routines, school, homework, dinner, but the doll lingered in the back of her mind. That night, when she returned to her room, she hesitated before going to bed. She took the doll off the shelf and placed it at the very back of her closet, behind some old clothes and boxes. Then she shut the closet door tightly. There, she muttered to herself, "Now you can't bother me." But when she woke up the next morning, the doll was back on the shelf. Emily stared at it, her heart pounding. How was that possible? She had put it in the closet, she was sure of it. She hadn't touched it. No one else could have moved it. She approached the doll cautiously, as if expecting it to jump at her. Its glassy eyes were fixed on her again, and for the first time, Emily noticed something strange. The doll's hair, its curly brown locks, seemed shinier than before, almost real. And its face, there was something different about the face. The once porcelain skin seemed smoother, less like a doll and more like flesh. Emily swallowed hard and backed away from the shelf. She couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that clung to her. She didn't want the doll. She didn't want it in her room anymore. It wasn't right. "Mom," Emily called from her bedroom door, her voice quivering. Her mother appeared a moment later, smiling warmly. "What is it, sweetie?" "I don't like the doll," Emily blurted out, her words tumbling over each other. "It's weird. I don't want it in my room." Her mother frowned. "But it was a gift. It's just a doll, Emily." "I know, but it keeps moving." Emily hesitated, realizing how ridiculous she sounded. "It wasn't on the shelf this morning. I put it in the closet." Her mother's smile faded slightly, but she kept her tone gentle. "Emily, it's probably just your imagination. You might have moved it without realizing. Don't worry, okay?" But Emily wasn't convinced. She wasn't imagining it. She knew what she had seen. The doll was different. It was wrong, and she had to get rid of it. That night, Emily decided to try something else. She took the doll down to the kitchen, wrapped it in a plastic bag, and carried it out to the trash bin behind the house. She tossed it inside, shoved the lid firmly, and ran back inside before she could change her mind. "There," she whispered. "Now it's gone." But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Emily spent the next morning in an unusual state of calm. After throwing the doll into the trash, she convinced herself it was over. No more doll staring at her from the shelf, no more creepy dreams, no more strange feelings in the pit of her stomach. It was Saturday, and she could finally relax. Her parents noticed the change in her demeanor. Over breakfast, her mother commented, "You seem happier today. Emily, did you sleep better last night?" Emily nodded, poking at her pancakes. "Yeah, I did. I don't think I'll have any more problems." Her father chuckled, unaware of the deeper meaning behind her words. "Good to hear, Tito. Maybe you're getting over that spooky imagination of yours." Emily smiled weakly, though she didn't feel like explaining further. To her, the doll was no longer an issue. It was gone for good, and that was all that mattered. After breakfast, she spent the day playing outside with her neighborhood friends, riding her bike, and basking in the warm sunlight that stretched across the suburban streets. For the first time in weeks, her thoughts weren't consumed by the unsettling presence of the doll. It was just a normal day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily's sense of relief remained intact. She headed inside, took a shower, undressed in her pajamas, offered a quick dinner with her parents. She was ready to crawl into bed and enjoy another peaceful night's sleep. But as she opened the door to her bedroom, she froze in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart dropped like a stone into her stomach. The doll was sitting on her bed. Its glassy blue eyes stared blankly at her, its porcelain face expressionless. It was positioned perfectly in the center of the bed, sitting upright, with its tiny hands resting on its lap. The familiar white dress with pink flowers was pristine, untouched, and its hair, the hair, looked shinier, even more lifelike than before. "No," Emily whispered, backing away slowly. "No, no, no." She had thrown it away. She had thrown it in the trash, and now here it was, back in her room as though nothing had ever happened. The knot in her stomach twisted tighter, and she felt the creeping sense of dread return, stronger than ever. "Mom, Dad," Emily screamed, her voice trembling as she ran down the hall to their bedroom. She threw the door open, startling her parents, who were getting ready for bed. "What's wrong, Emily?" her mother asked, concerned. "The doll. It's back. I threw it away, and it's back on my bed." Emily's words came out in a rush, and she could feel the panic rising in her chest. She knew how crazy it sounded, but she didn't care. She needed them to see it, to understand. Her father sighed, already halfway into his pajamas. "Emily, it's just a doll. No, you don't get it. I threw it away outside, in the trash bin. How could it be back in my room?" Her voice cracked as she pleaded with them. "Please, just come look, please." Her mother exchanged a concerned glance with her father before nodding. "Okay, sweetie, let's go take a look. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." Together, they walked down the hall to Emily's room, her mother flicking on the light as they entered. And there it was, the doll, sitting exactly where Emily had described, perched in the center of the bed, its lifelike features casting an eerie shadow in the soft glow of the overhead light. Her mother frowned, clearly puzzled. "That's strange. I thought you said you put it in the closet." Emily shook her head frantically. "No, I threw it away. I put it in the outside trash bin last night." Her father walked over to the bed and picked up the doll, examining it closely. Well, maybe you thought you threw it away, but somehow it ended up back here. Maybe it's a prank. One of your friends could have put it back in your room. Emily shook her head again. Nobody came into the house today. Dad, I know I threw it away. Her mother knelt down in front of her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Emily, honey, I believe you're scared, but maybe you're just imagining things because you don't like the doll. Why don't we take it away for real this time? Emily hesitated, her skin crawling at the thought of the doll's eyes following her even now. Take it far away. I don't want it here anymore. Her father smiled reassuringly. How about I take it to the donation center tomorrow morning? Someone else can have it, and you won't have to worry about it coming back. Emily nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. She wasn't convinced that getting rid of it would be so simple, but she had no other choice. She just wanted it gone. That night, her father placed the doll in a box and took it down to the basement, locking the door behind him. There, it won't be bothering you tonight, he promised. Emily went to bed feeling slightly more at ease, but the unease still lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the memory of how the doll had returned after she discarded it, how it had found its way back to her bed like it belonged there. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams filled with vague, shadowy figures and faint whispers she couldn't make out. And then, in the middle of the night, she heard it, a faint scratching sound. At first, Emily thought it was part of her dream, but as she woke slowly, the sound became clearer, persistent, as though something was clawing at the walls. Her heart raced. She turned her head toward the closet. The door was slightly ajar, and through the thin crack, she thought she saw movement. A flash of white, a glimpse of something too small to be a person, but too large to be an animal. No. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like something was trying to get in, or out. With trembling hands, Emily reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on. The light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows, but the scratching didn't stop. She slipped out of bed, her feet barely making a sound as she tiptoed toward the closet. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave it alone, to run and get her parents, but something deeper, some morbid curiosity pushed her forward. Slowly, she opened the closet door. The doll wasn't inside. Instead, a trail of scuff marks led from the closet to the window, as if something had been dragging its small body across the floor. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She followed the marks with her eyes, and there, sitting by the window, was the doll. But it wasn't the same doll as before. Its porcelain face had changed. The once smooth features had softened, the skin taking on a more realistic texture. The blue eyes, which had once been glass, were now unsettlingly close to human eyes. And the hair, it was no longer just synthetic curls. It looked and felt like real hair, her own hair, flowing down the doll's shoulders in soft, delicate waves. Emily stumbled back, her legs barely supporting her weight. Her throat tightened, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The doll stared up at her, its once empty face now filled with something disturbingly alive. And then, slowly, so slowly, the doll blinked. Emily's scream pierced the night. Her parents burst into the room moments later, their faces etched with concern. Emily, what happened? But when they looked around, the room seemed empty. The doll was back on the shelf, its eyes as lifeless and still as before. Emily could only point, her body trembling uncontrollably. It blinked, it moved, it's changing. Her father's expression softened with sympathy. Emily, you had a bad dream. The doll's right where I left it. No, it was sitting by the window. It's not a dream. Emily cried, but she could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe her. No one would. We'll get rid of it tomorrow, her mother promised, pulling her into a tight embrace. I swear, it'll be gone. Just try to sleep. But Emily knew better now. The doll wasn't going anywhere, not until it had finished what it started. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with the air in Emily's bedroom feeling thick and oppressive. The events of the previous night still haunted her. She could barely force herself to look at the doll on the shelf, its blank, unblinking eyes watching her every move. Sleep had been elusive, and the terror she had felt as the doll blinked remained lodged in her chest like a sharp, twisting knot. Emily didn't bother trying to explain herself to her parents again. They wouldn't believe her, just as they hadn't believed her last night. Instead, she ate her breakfast in silence, her gaze fixed on her plate as her mother and father chatted absent-mindedly. The doll was the only thing she could think about, its lifelike features etched into her mind like a haunting specter. But today was supposed to be the day. Today, her father had promised to take the doll far away to the donation center, where it could haunt someone else. Just the thought of getting rid of it was enough to lift some of the weight off her chest. She clung to that hope, like a drowning person clinging to a life raft. "Are you ready to go, Emily?" her father asked, breaking her from her thoughts. "We'll take it down to the donation center, and then we can stop for ice cream on the way home. How does that sound?" Emily nodded eagerly, though the idea of stopping for ice cream barely registered in her mind. She just wanted the doll gone, forever. Her father walked upstairs to retrieve the doll, while Emily and her mother waited by the front door. Emily's heart pounded with each passing second, her ears straining for the sound of his footsteps. She expected something to go wrong, anything, but then he came down the stairs, carrying the doll in the box he had placed it in the night before. It was nestled in a blanket, its eyes hidden, as if it had been tucked away for good. "Let's go," her father said with a smile. The drive to the donation center was quiet, the car's atmosphere tense. Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window, unwilling to look at the box that sat in the front seat beside her father. Even though it was just a box, she could feel the doll's presence, as if it was still watching her from within. Every bump in the road sent a shiver down her spine, and she had to keep reminding herself that this would all be over soon. When they finally arrived at the donation center, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her father carried the box inside while she and her mother waited in the car. After what felt like an eternity, he returned, dusting off his hands with a satisfied grin. "There," he said, climbing back into the driver's seat. "It's gone." Emily let out a long, shaky breath. "Are you sure?" Her father chuckled. "Yes, Emily, I'm sure. It's gone for good." Emily leaned back in her seat, a sense of calm finally settling over her. It was over. The doll was gone. She could finally go back to her normal life without the constant fear of that thing lurking in her room. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a world where the doll didn't exist, where she didn't have to worry about it creeping back into her life. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, Emily slept soundly. There were no dreams of the doll, no scratching sound in the walls, no feelings of being watched. It was as though a dark cloud had lifted, leaving her room warm and peaceful again. When she woke up the next morning, she felt refreshed, almost like a different person. She got ready for school without hesitation, humming to herself as she brushed her hair and packed her backpack. Her parents noticed the change in her mood, and her mother smiled brightly at the sight of her daughter's happiness. "You seem like your old self again," her mother said as Emily grabbed her breakfast. "I'm so glad we took care of that doll situation. I knew you just needed some peace of mind." Emily grinned back, feeling lighter than she had in days. "Yeah, I feel so much better now." She left for school, the worries of the past week beginning to fade away as the day progressed. Her friends were quick to notice her cheerful demeanor, and by the time she returned home that afternoon, Emily was fully convinced that the nightmare was finally behind her. But that night, something changed. Emily had just finished brushing her teeth when she heard it, the familiar, faint scratching sound from behind her bedroom door. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, she froze in place, her toothbrush still in her hand. No, she thought. It can't be. It's gone. But the sound persisted. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Slowly, Emily placed her toothbrush down and walked toward her bedroom door, her footsteps hesitant. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to see what was on the other side. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making the noise knew she was there. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She twisted it slowly, pulling the door open just enough to peek inside. And there, sitting in the middle of her bed, was the doll. Its blue eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its face, had changed again. The once porcelain features were now soft, almost human. Its skin looked real, and its hair, now flowing in silky waves down its back, was undeniably Emily's. Emily's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. No, it can't be. It's gone. It's gone. But the doll was there, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It had returned, more alive than ever. She could feel it, sense the malevolent energy radiating from its small, fragile body. The doll wasn't just following her anymore, it was becoming her. The door creaked behind her, and she jumped as her mother poked her head in, her expression filled with concern. "Emily, what's wrong?" "Mom, it's back. The doll is back." Emily pointed to the bed, but her voice broke as she realized the doll was no longer there. The bed was empty, the blankets undisturbed. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Her mother frowned, stepping into the room. "Emily, there's no doll here. You're just imagining things again." "No, I swear, it was right there. It's been changing, becoming more like me. It's alive." Emily's voice rose to a frantic pitch, but her mother only sighed and knelt beside her, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Sweetie, you've been through a lot lately. Maybe you're just tired. Why don't you get some rest?" Emily shook her head violently. "No, I'm not tired. I know what I saw. Please, you have to believe me." Her mother stroked her hair, whispering soothing words, but Emily could feel the disbelief in her touch. No one believed her. No one saw what she saw. That night, Emily stayed awake 4 hours, her eyes glued to the spot on the bed where the doll had been. She knew it wasn't over. It would come back. It always came back. As the hours ticked by, she heard the scratching again, and this time she didn't need to open the door to know the doll was waiting. But Emily didn't scream. She didn't run for her parents. She knew what was coming next. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, Emily didn't wake up, at least, not in the way she expected. She felt strange, heavy, stiff, as if her body didn't belong to her anymore. Her eyes fluttered open, but everything was blurry, her vision distorted by an odd, glassy sheen. And then she realized she wasn't lying in her bed. She was sitting on the shelf. Her heart pounded in her chest, or it should have, but there was no heartbeat, no breath, no movement. Emily tried to scream, to move, but she couldn't. She was trapped. She could see her body lying in the bed, peaceful and still, but she wasn't in it anymore. She was in the doll. The doll had become her, and as she stared down at her motionless form, her porcelain fingers curling ever so slightly, she realized that she was never going to leave. Not until someone else took her place, and she would make sure they did. Emily's new reality sank in slowly, like a poison spreading through her soul. She was trapped inside the doll, a hollow, porcelain figure that had once been an object of terror. Now, she was that terror. She could no longer feel her heartbeat or take in a breath of air. Instead, she sat frozen on the shelf, a prisoner in her own bedroom, watching the world unfold through glassy, painted eyes. Time became a strange, formless thing. Days and nights passed in a blur, but they no longer held any meaning for Emily. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't blink. All she could do was watch as her family went about their lives, blissfully unaware of the horror lurking in the room with them. Her body, the body that was no longer hers, continued to move as if nothing had changed. Every morning, Emily watched herself rise from the bed, brush her hair, and go through the motions of daily life. It wasn't really her, though. It was the doll, wearing her skin like a disguise, perfectly imitating every aspect of her life. At first, Emily had tried to scream, to shout, to move, but her porcelain lips remained sealed, and her tiny limbs wouldn't respond to her frantic thoughts. No matter how hard she struggled, she remained bound to the shelf, powerless to do anything but observe. The days stretched into weeks, and the frustration turned into despair. Emily felt herself slipping away, her sense of self dissolving in the silence. How long could she endure this? How long before she forgot who she truly was and became nothing more than the cold, unfeeling doll she inhabited? But something changed as the weeks passed. The more time Emily spent trapped in the doll, the more she began to understand it. It wasn't just a cursed object, it was something far darker. The doll wasn't merely taking over her life, it was absorbing her soul, feeding off her essence, growing stronger with each passing day. It was a living, malevolent entity, and it had done this before. Emily wasn't its first victim, and she wouldn't be the last. From her perch on the shelf, Emily could feel the doll's power growing, slowly, steadily. It thrived on her fear, her helplessness. Every moment she spent trapped inside it, the doll became more alive, more human. And then, one day, Emily saw something she hadn't expected. As she watched her body move through the house, interacting with her parents, her friends, and everyone else who thought she was still the same Emily, she noticed a shift. It was subtle at first, a strange hesitation in her movements, a flicker of something unnatural in her eyes. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The thing that was wearing her body was changing. Its mimicry of her had been flawless at first, but now, cracks were beginning to show. Her parents didn't notice. How could they? They were too busy, too distracted to see the difference. But Emily saw it. She saw how the thing that had taken her place moved with an eerie, mechanical precision, how it smiled too widely, how its laughter was hollow and wrong. It wasn't just copying her anymore, it was becoming something else entirely, something inhuman. One night, as her family sat down for dinner, Emily watched from her perch on the shelf, helpless as always. But this time, there was a new tension in the air. Her mother glanced at Emily, a puzzled frown creasing her brow. "Sweetie," her mother said cautiously, "are you feeling okay? You've been acting a little off lately." The thing wearing Emily's skin looked up from its plate, its eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I'm fine, Mom," it said, its voice perfectly normal. But there was something beneath the surface, something dark and cold. Her mother hesitated, glancing at her husband for support, but he was too engrossed in his phone to notice. "It's just, you don't seem like yourself lately," her mother continued. "Maybe we should take you to see Dr. Miller." The thing's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "I'm fine," it repeated, a bit more forcefully this time. Emily's heart, if she still had one, would have been pounding. She could feel the tension building, feel the malevolence radiating from the thing in her place. It wasn't going to let anyone get in its way. It was going to keep pretending to be her until it no longer needed to pretend. That night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. It was subtle, a faint stirring in her porcelain limbs. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then the sensation grew stronger. She could move. Not much, just the slightest twitch of her fingers, but it was enough to fill her with a glimmer of hope. She focused all her willpower on her hand, willing it to move. Slowly, painfully, her fingers curled into a fist. It was excruciating, like pushing through layers of thick, invisible chains, but she could do it. She could fight. The doll had taken so much from her, but it hadn't taken everything. There was still a part of her left, a part that could resist. Emily spent the next few nights testing her newfound ability, learning how to move her limbs again. It was a slow, agonizing process, but every small movement brought her closer to freedom. She had no idea how much time had passed, but she didn't care. All that mattered was that she was no longer completely powerless. She would find a way to stop the thing that had taken her place. She would reclaim her life, no matter what it took. Underscore, 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 underscore. One evening, when the house was quiet and the thing was asleep in her bed, Emily made her move. She focused all her energy on her legs, willing them to swing off the shelf. Her tiny porcelain feet hit the floor with a soft clink, and for the first time since she had been trapped, Emily stood up. Her legs were stiff, her movements jerky and unnatural, but she was moving. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to act quickly. She didn't know how much time she had before the thing woke up and realized what was happening. With trembling hands, Emily crept toward the bed where her body lay. The thing was curled up under the blankets, its face serene in the dim light. For a brief moment, it looked just like her, but Emily knew better. She could feel the darkness emanating from it, the malevolent force that had stolen her life. She had no plan, no idea what she would do when she reached it, but she couldn't stop now. She had to confront it. She had to try. As she approached the bed, the thing stirred. Its eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they locked with Emily's. There was no shock, no fear in its gaze, only cold amusement. "You're awake," it whispered, its voice low and mocking. Emily's tiny, porcelain hands balled into fists. She wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound came out. Instead, she reached out, her fingers trembling as she grasped the edge of the blanket. The thing's smile widened, and before Emily could react, it lunged. With unnatural speed, it was on her, its cold, pale hands wrapping around her fragile porcelain body. Emily tried to fight back, but the thing was too strong. It pinned her to the ground, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of glee. "You thought you could stop me," it hissed. "You're nothing but a doll now. I'm the one who's alive. I'm the real Emily." The thing's grip tightened, and Emily felt her porcelain body begin to crack under the pressure. She struggled, but it was no use. She was losing. But just as the thing prepared to crush her completely, a voice cut through the darkness. "Emily," it was her mother, standing in the doorway, her face pale with confusion and fear. "What's going on? What are you?" The thing froze, its smile faltering. It hadn't expected to be caught. and in that moment of hesitation, Emily saw her chance. With all the strength she had left, she threw herself at the thing, her porcelain fingers clawing at its face. The thing screamed, its form flickering, shifting. For the first time, it looked vulnerable. Emily pressed on, pushing with everything she had. She could feel the thing's grip on her soul weakening, feel herself slipping back into her body, and then, with a final, desperate surge of willpower, she shattered the doll. There was a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, everything went dark. When Emily opened her eyes, she was lying in her bed, her body her own again. The thing was gone. The doll was gone. It was over. Her mother rushed to her side, tears streaming down her face. Emily, oh, thank God, you're okay. Emily hugged her tightly, relief flooding through her. The nightmare was finally over. Or so she hoped. Emily woke up in her bed, her body finally her own again. Her mother's arms were wrapped tightly around her, tears streaming down her face. The room was bathed in the soft glow of morning light, filtering through the curtains as if the horror of the night had never happened. But Emily knew better. She had fought her way back from a nightmare that wasn't just a dream, but a dark and twisted reality. For a moment, she lay there, too exhausted to move. Her body ached as if she had been physically battling for hours, though she had no visible bruises or cuts. The doll, the thing that had taken her place, was gone. But something about the silence in the room felt heavy, as if the air itself were waiting for something. Her mother pulled back, cupping Emily's face in her hands. "Sweetie, what happened? You were screaming, and then you just collapsed." I thought. Her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Emily tried to find the words to explain, but the experience was too surreal, too horrifying to put into simple terms. How could she describe the feeling of being trapped inside a doll, watching as her life was stolen piece by piece? How could she explain the malevolent force that had inhabited her, taken over her body, and tried to erase her from existence? "It's over now," was all she could manage, her voice hoarse and trembling. "The doll, it's gone." Her mother frowned, clearly not understanding. "The doll? What doll? What are you talking about?" Emily sat up slowly, her mind racing. She glanced around the room, searching for any trace of the cursed doll, any sign that it had been real and not some horrible hallucination. But the shelf where it had once sat was empty. The porcelain shards she had shattered were gone. Everything looked normal, too normal. "I know it sounds crazy," Emily whispered, more to herself than her mother, "but it was real. It took me, Mom. It became me." Her mother's expression softened, but there was still confusion in her eyes. "You've been through a lot, sweetheart. Maybe you just had a nightmare. It's okay now. You're safe." Emily wanted to believe her. She wanted to pretend that everything was back to normal, that it had all been just a bad dream. But deep down, she knew the truth. The doll wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It had been real, too real. And even though it was gone, the lingering sense of dread wouldn't leave her. She slid out of bed, her legs shaky but functional, and headed toward the shelf where the doll had once sat. Her fingers ran over the smooth surface, half expecting to feel the cold, porcelain presence of the cursed object. But there was nothing, not even a crack to indicate it had ever existed. "It was here," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "It was here." Her mother, still concerned, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let's go downstairs and get some breakfast. You need to rest, okay?" Emily nodded absently, her mind still swirling with the events of the night. As she followed her mother out of the room, a deep unease settled in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Underscore 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 underscore. Over the next few days, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Emily went back to school, spent time with her friends, and tried to focus on her homework. But the feeling of unease never left her. She found herself glancing over her shoulder constantly, expecting to see the doll lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to reclaim her. She also noticed small, subtle changes around her. Her reflection in the mirror seemed slightly off, her movement a fraction slower than they should have been. Sometimes she would catch herself zoning out for long stretches of time, only to snap back into awareness with no memory of what she had been doing. It was as if part of her had been damaged during the fight with the doll, like a crack running through her very soul. She didn't feel fully herself anymore, but she couldn't tell if that was because of the trauma she'd endured, or if something far worse was at play. One evening, as she sat in her room trying to focus on a book, the feeling of being watched returned. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and a familiar, icy chill crept down her spine. She glanced up, half expecting to see the doll's cold, glassy eyes staring back at her from the shelf. But the shelf was empty. Still, the sensation wouldn't leave her. It was as if something was lurking just out of sight, hiding in the corners of the room, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emily stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly turned, scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet, still air of her bedroom. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible creak came from the closet. Emily froze, her pulse quickening. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough for someone or something to be hiding inside. She hadn't opened it since the night everything had happened. It had remained shut, untouched. She took a slow, cautious step toward the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Was the doll somehow back? Had it returned to finish what it had started? Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She hesitated for a moment, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, with a quick, decisive motion, she yanked the door open. The closet was empty. She let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. But just as she turned to close the door, she saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. Her heart leapt into her throat as she spun around. But once again, there was nothing there. Emily's nerves were on edge. She couldn't take this anymore. The paranoia, the constant fear, it was eating away at her. She needed answers. She needed to know if the doll was truly gone, or if it was still out there, waiting to claim her again. She decided to do the one thing she hadn't done yet, research. She spent hours scouring the internet, digging through forums and websites that dealt with cursed objects, haunted dolls, and supernatural phenomena. The more she read, the more she realized that what had happened to her wasn't unique. There were countless stories of people who had encountered objects like the doll, objects that seemed to possess a will of their own, trapping their victims in a cycle of fear and possession. But there was one detail that caught her attention. In many of the stories, the cursed object didn't just disappear once it had been defeated. It changed. It took on a new form, a new disguise, and waited for the right moment to strike again. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she read those words. What if the doll hadn't been destroyed? What if it was still here, hiding in plain sight? Her gaze drifted to the small, seemingly innocuous objects around her room, the stuffed animals, the knickknacks, the trinkets she had collected over the years. Any one of them could be the doll in disguise, waiting for its chance to strike. Emily stood up, her body tense with dread. She couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, constantly wondering if the doll was still with her. She needed to find it, to destroy it once and for all. As she scanned the room, her eyes fell on something she hadn't noticed before, a small, delicate figurine sitting on her windowsill. It was a ballerina, carved from porcelain, with the same eerie, lifelike quality that the doll had possessed. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never seen it before. She didn't know where it had come from. With trembling hands, Emily picked up the figurine, her mind racing. It was cold to the touch, unnervingly smooth. As she held it, she felt a familiar, sickening sense of dread wash over her. The doll hadn't been destroyed. It had simply changed form, and it was still watching her. Underscore 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 underscore. Emily stood there, the porcelain figurine in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the curse continue. She couldn't let the doll, or whatever it had become, take her again. With a sudden burst of anger and fear, she held the figurine against the wall. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, fragments of porcelain scattering across the floor. But as the pieces lay there, glittering in the dim light, Emily realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't over. The curse was still there, and it would never truly be gone, because the doll was her.